Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Institute of Politics Speaker Series event featuring Bethany McLean and in discussion with her new book, Shaky Ground, The Strange Saga of the U.S. Mortgage Crisis. We're pleased to be here with all of you tonight and partnering with a number of entities. Pleased to be back here at Booth. As always, they've been gracious hosts to us once again. I wanted to point out to you tonight that, as is customary, we will take your questions from the audience. We'll do so about midway through the conversation. So when we get to you, we ask that you come prepared with questions and that they are indeed questions. And as we like to say here, that you keep your questions short and to the point so we can get to as many of you as possible. My name is Steve Edwards. I'm the executive director at the IOP. And tonight's event is just another in our series of conversations bringing leading players in politics and public policy to campus to give us their thoughts and insights on key issues of the day. Coming up right after Thanksgiving, we have two big programs that I wanted to put on your radar screen. For those of you interested in economic and financial matters, I want to especially highlight an event we have coming up on December 1st. It will take place downtown at the Gleacher Center. It'll be an economic outlook conversation featuring Austin Goolsbee, here of Chicago Booth, in conversation with Kai Risdall of Marketplace. So it should be a great conversation. That takes place at 6 p.m. at the Gleacher Center downtown on December 1st. There are flyers in front if you didn't pick one up that have more information. We ask that you RSVP in advance, but that is free and open to the public. Also, the night before, we'll come back straight after Thanksgiving by welcoming former U.S. Ambassador to China and former Republican presidential candidate Jon Huntsman, who will be here to talk not only about the current 2016 presidential race, but in great detail look at the U.S.-China relationship. He's been featured in a new documentary that is getting some release some of you may have heard about. We'll be screening the documentary this coming Monday, the 23rd, and then the following Monday, the 30th, he'll be here on campus for an event at the Quadrangle Club. That's also at 6 o'clock. So Huntsman on Monday, the 30th, and then Goolsbee and Risdall on Tuesday the 1st. We hope you'll join us for both of those. You can sign up for all of our events, by the way, by going to our website, politics.uchicago.edu. You can sign up for our email. It comes out every Monday, and you get updates on what's upcoming in our calendar. Without further ado, let me step aside and turn over the podium to Bess Goodfellow to formally introduce our guest tonight. Bess is a third year in the college. She is double majoring in sociology and economics. She is chairing our fellows program as a member of our student advisory board here at the IOP. We have a 9-member student group that helps advise and plan and program the IOP from that perspective. And so she oversees our fellows program and hails from Columbia, Missouri. So please join me in welcoming Bess to the podium. Bess.
I'm pleased to welcome tonight's speaker, Bethany McLean, who is here to discuss her book, Shaky Ground, The Strange Saga of the U.S. Mortgage Crisis. Shaky Ground chronicles the story of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, from their origins of serving the American dream of home ownership to their central position in the housing crisis to the limbo they're in today, 7 years after financial meltdown. In her book, Ms. McLean tells us why home ownership finance is one of the biggest unsolved issues today and why the housing market needs to be placed on firmer ground. Bethany McLean, a former fellow at the IOP, is an investigative journalist best known for her reporting on the Enron scandal and 2008 financial crisis. She is the co-author of the best-selling book, The Smartest Guys in the Room, The Amazing Rise and Scandalous Fall of Enron, written with her fortunate colleague Peter Elkind. A documentary adaptation of the book was nominated for the Academy Award in 2006. She co-authored her second book, titled All the Devils Are Here, The Hidden History of the Financial Crisis, with New York Times columnist Jonah Serra. She is currently a contributing editor to Vanity Fair, a columnist for Fortune.com, and a contributor to CNBC. Joining her to moderate tonight's discussion is Harris School of Public Policy professor Benjamin Keys. Professor Keys is the co-director of the Kreisman Initiative on Housing Law and Policy and studies issues related to household finance, urban economics, and labor finance. If you would like to purchase Shaky Ground, it will be available after the discussion. Please join me in welcoming Bethany McLean and Benjamin Keys.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm excited to be here because this is an area that I do spend some of my time researching. I'm very curious to figure out why all of you are here to hear about an area that doesn't get nearly enough attention. So I'm thrilled that you're all here to hear more and learn more about the mortgage market and Fannie and Freddie in particular. So Bethany, why don't we start by just giving a little bit of background about the mortgage market, why we should care about the mortgage market, and then sort of what Fannie and Freddie are and where they came from.
So I think of Fannie and Freddie as part of the hidden machinery of our world, which we don't see and never think about until it malfunctions and kind of pokes us in an unpleasant place. And most Americans don't even realize what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are, despite the fact that most Americans have a very intimate financial relationship with these two companies. Fannie Mae was created in the aftermath of the Great Depression, and the idea was that if you had this company that could buy up mortgages that lenders made, then the lenders would be willing to make more mortgages than they would otherwise, because they knew they could sell them and they wouldn't have to keep the mortgages on their books, and that would free up capital and help homeownership, which, by the way, it's fascinating. Homeownership goes back to the 1800s as this thing that politicians for years have viewed as important in American life. It's not a recent phenomenon. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac for a long time essentially functioned as insurance companies. They would buy these mortgages and they began to stamp them with a guarantee that you, the homeowner, would pay. And if you couldn't pay, then Fannie and Freddie would pay instead. And they would bundle them up into securities and sell them off to investors. And investors needed this guarantee because most big investors around the world don't want your credit risk. They're not equipped to look through, say, a package of 100,000 mortgages and decide, are people really going to pay? So this structure of having Fannie and Freddie guarantee the credit risk on these mortgages meant that these securities of theirs could be sold around the world. And investors viewed them as almost akin to treasury debt. And by that mechanism, you had a system. It was really globalization at work, and it seemed like a really good thing until it wasn't, where you could have, in effect, a saver in China financing the purchase of a home in Kansas. And you had foreign banks and other institutions become huge holders. At one point, they own 25% of these institutions' securities outstanding, the debt of our homes. And this is a huge market. Make no mistake about it. The American mortgage market is one of the biggest in the world. Fannie and Freddie today have over 5 trillion of these securities outstanding, making them collectively the largest financial institution in the world. And so there's also a widespread belief, although we don't really know that it's true because we've had Fannie since the aftermath of the Great Depression, but there's a widespread belief that this product we all take for granted, a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, wouldn't exist without Fannie and Freddie. The only other country that has such a product is tiny Denmark. And the reason why, again, is that there aren't enough investors who want your credit risk, and they certainly don't want it for 30 years. So there's this belief that this product that is really a bedrock of American life. I think I saw data from the Urban Institute that the last data I saw was that 80% of people who took out a mortgage chose this 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. We wouldn't have that product if it weren't for these two institutions. And this might seem a little bit like a theoretical discussion, but if you think about it, a mortgage is the most important financial instrument in most Americans' lives, right? It is one thing that we are all going to tangle with over time. The availability of mortgage credit and the price of it shapes the price of homes, which homes are still the most important asset most Americans have, and housing is still an incredibly important part of our economy. The Treasury Secretary to President Roosevelt once described housing as the wheel within the wheel of our great economy, and it still is that. Housing makes up 15 to 20% of GDP. So if you don't have the structure for housing finance right, not only all of our lives and all of our economic lives are fundamentally different.
So housing finance starts through Fannie and then the creation of Freddie in this very government-oriented way. So these are fully public firms. They essentially act as these government insurers. And we get this big shift in the 1960s towards a much messier sort of public-private amalgam. I'm wondering if you could talk about that transition a little bit and how things shifted and how incentives shifted around
Right.
that time?
So for a long time, Fannie Mae was a government entity. Although interestingly enough, when Roosevelt sent this company up, he didn't want it to be a government entity. The idea was that private capital would fund this company. And the government even offered all sorts of inducements to have private capital fund Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They offered to match it dollar to dollar. No private capital wanted anything to do with it. And the reason why was that private capital was scarred in the wake of the Great Depression. They didn't want anything to do with American mortgage risk. So the government ended up funding it. So I think it's interesting that it wasn't set out to be a creature of the Great Society. It actually was supposed to be a private market institution. Anyway, so Fannie Mae was fully a government creature until the 1960s when it was privatized by Lyndon Johnson to get it off the budget during the Vietnam War so that we didn't have to reflect the debt of American homeowners in the budget. So Paul Volcker, the famous Treasury Secretary, Federal Reserve Chairman, Treasury Secretary too, later complained that it was privatized for these totally ridiculous reasons. And these sort of history of ridiculous reasons are actually part of the history of Fannie and Freddie, which is sort of shocking when you think about how important this whole thing is. And you look at how many times things have been done for reasons that are really head scratchers in retrospect. So Fannie ended up this really strange institution. I've always thought of it as kind of like a mythical beast, sort of part man, part centaur. It was part government entity. It was called a government-sponsored enterprise with a charter by Congress that mandated it to help with affordable housing and help make mortgages affordable to all people. But then it was a publicly traded company with stockholders and a board of directors and with a responsibility to the bottom line, just like any publicly traded company. So for a long time, people said, how can you have a company with this dual mission? That's a total conflict of interest. Such a structure can never work. And that was part of the longstanding criticism of these two companies, was that there was this conflict inherent in the way that they were structured.
So they had the head that was leading to profits for the investors and the CEOs, and the tail that was the downside risk. So any losses would be the government. So this was sort of the heads you win and tails I lose.
Although that was never the way that it was supposed to be. And so this is another really funny aspect of these companies. They had what was called an implicit guarantee. And what that means is that officially the US government did not stand behind their debt. These were supposed to be companies. If they defaulted, they defaulted. But everybody thought that if the situation ever became dire, the US government would have to step in and stand behind their debt. And we know that's exactly what happened. So for a long time, people referred to this as the implicit guarantee. And I mean, really think about it. What a strange thing to exist in a supposedly rational economy, to have an implicit guarantee, right? This thing that isn't written down, that doesn't exist anywhere, but nonetheless was incredibly valuable because it allowed Fannie and Freddie to borrow money at much cheaper rates than an ordinary company could, and that made them much more profitable than ordinary companies would be.
So on this point about the tension between sort of the private side and the public side, one of the features that was really unique and problematic about these institutions is this sort of profit motive, and in particular the portfolios of loans that they put on their books. And so over sort of just fast forwarding through the timeline and into the 1990s and the 2000s, we see Fannie and Freddie accumulating assets on their portfolio side. And can you talk a little bit about what the motivations were there?
So one of the many things that made these two companies really profitable was that during the 1990s, they saw this great opportunity to make money. Not only were they going to function as an insurance company where they basically guaranteed that you, the American homeowner, was going to pay the principal and interest on your mortgage, but they said, if we buy these mortgages, these mortgage-backed securities, and keep them on our own balance sheet, we can earn the difference between the spread, the income on this portfolio of mortgage securities and our own cost of funds, which is really low because of our implicit guarantee. And so this made them incredibly controversial because they were holding all this risk on their own balance sheet. They had to use a ton of derivatives in order to manage it. And it really heightened the criticism of them from some very powerful sources. Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, became a huge foe of Fannie and Freddie during the 1990s. He used to refer to their way of making money as the big fat gap, because it was this gap between their cost of funds and the income they could make on their securities. And just to put this in some context, at its peak, this portfolio of securities was $1.6 trillion. This was not a small number. And at the time when it peaked at $1.6 trillion, I think the total American debt was $9 trillion. I mean, think of those two numbers. It's just enormous. The scale was phenomenal. But it made Fannie and Freddie two of the most profitable companies around. I think their profits per employee, Fannie was number 3 on the Fortune 500, and Freddie was right behind. They were phenomenal investments during the decade of the 1990s because they produced this great earnings growth growth, which Wall Street wanted to see. And it made their executives very, very rich.
So one of the fun things about studying the mortgage market is that most of the dollar denominations that we talk about are measured in billions and trillions. And so it immediately sounds like it's an important part of the economy. And I think thinking about the mortgage market more generally, and with housing, there's a large political faction that sort of lines up to defend this industry and defend the sort of dual public-private nature, which that group has then sort of flipped their story around in certain ways. Some of them have been consistent in the wake of the crisis, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the political power that Fannie and Freddie were able to wield during the boom years.
Right. So Fannie, and in some ways this was logical. Fannie always understood that there were forces in the government that wanted to kill it, right? Which is one of the many strange things about this story. Two companies created by the U.S. government that some in the U.S. government always wanted to kill. And some of the people who wanted to kill it had purely ideological opposition. Why do we need the government's thumb on the scale of homeownership? Aren't there better uses of government's power? This is distorting the housing market. It's hard to find an economist, liberal or conservative, who likes the idea of the government being involved in the housing market. So Fannie began to develop a really powerful lobbying apparatus in order to counter this, what one of its lobbyists once called the vampire issue, this thing they could never get rid of that some people just wanted to see it dead. So in some ways it was a legitimate response, but Fannie developed what a former Congressman, Jim Leach, used to call the greatest, most formidable lobbying operation in history. There used to be jokes in Washington that if you said a bad thing about Fannie Mae, you could hear the fax machines going. This was back in the era when we had fax machines. But there was this idea that you couldn't even whisper a criticism of Fannie, and suddenly there'd be a Fannie lobbyist calling you up or calling up the person you worked for saying you better watch it. They were totally formidable. And they were part of what people have referred to as the housing industrial complex, which is sort of this loose-knit coalition of affordable housing activists, Fannie and Freddie, realtors, home builders, sort of everybody who has a stake in this enormous enterprise that is the American mortgage market. There's a great line from, I think it was the Washington Post, and it was that Fannie, and it was late 1990s when Fannie was at the height of its power, and it was that Fannie Mae has this grandmotherly image, but watch out, that if you do anything to offend them, they'll tie you up, they'll castrate you, they'll decapitate you, and they'll throw your body on the Potomac. So that was the and they made a lot of enemies because of that, which I think it helps inform some of the story today.
Right.
But in fairness, the other part of this that I want to touch on, when I first wrote about Fannie in 2004, I thought they were just a bad actor. I thought this political power was just unprecedented and incredibly frightening. And when they said, well, no, this fight is actually about money. The people on the other side of this, like the big banks, just want our market and our profit. And they're government-sponsored enterprises too. I was like, well, sure, guys, and what's wrong with that, even if they do? In retrospect, I actually agree with Fannie. It is making the story a little bit too pure to pretend that all their opponents were always pure and ideologically pure and just wanted the best for people. And Fannie was this evil political behemoth. There's right and wrong on both sides of the story, and it's absolutely true that Fannie's opponents really resented the fact that there was this government-sponsored enterprise making all these profits in the mortgage market, and they thought, get rid of Fannie and Freddie, weaken them, and there's more profits for us. So this was always a fight about money too. It wasn't just a fight about ideology. It was a fight about money.
Right. So
and it still is.
Yeah, absolutely. As hopefully we'll get to when the hedge funds enter the narrative. So in thinking about this advantage for these large companies, so Fannie and Freddie have this cost advantage, right? Because this implicit guarantee suggests to people that the government's going to come in and step in whenever there's trouble. So they can borrow very, very cheaply, and they can offer people a mortgage at a cheaper rate than the public market can. And so why does their market share decline during the housing boom, and why do they start to sort of slip from the position of preeminence that they had in the 90s?
Right. So this gets into one of the most controversial aspects of the financial crisis, and it really is a religious war even today. And I'm going to back up a little bit to answer your question to explain that. So when I was reporting this book, I was at a J.P. Morgan CEO dinner last winter, and a bank executive asked me what I was working on. And I said, I'm working on this book about Fannie and Freddie. And he said, oh, the hidden secret of the financial crisis, what no one will tell you, was that it was all caused by Fannie and Freddie and their pursuit of what were known as their affordable housing goals. Chronicles, their mandate to make sure that housing was available to middle and lower income Americans, that they purchase a certain percentage of mortgages made to middle and lower income Americans. I said, okay. So then I was at a wedding this fall, and a guy who was there said, oh, the secret of the financial crisis, what no one will tell you is that this whole thing was caused by Fannie and Freddie and therefore. Anyway, if it's a secret, it's the worst kept secret in the world. It's actually become a mantra on the right. And in some ways, it's very logical. It takes the complicated event of the financial crisis and makes it really simple, right? And we all want simplicity, even if it's just the illusion of simplicity. And it makes the answer to the financial crisis really simple, because if the whole thing was just the fault of government policies gone wrong, well, then the answer is really clear. Get rid of the government. We don't need any new regulation of the private sector. It was all the fault of the government. And little caveat, I'm not necessarily a fan of regulation. That's all regulation. That's another, I don't want to make it seem like I think all regulation is good. That's another story. But so it does get to this story about the GSEs and did they cause the financial crisis? And we can talk about that if you want in a minute. I don't want to lose sight of your question, which I might otherwise. My answer is no, absolutely not. But you can see that one of the ways you can see it is that Fannie and Freddie's market share began to decline precipitously before in the early 2000s. And the reason why is that Wall Street had basically come up with a way of going around Fannie and Freddie, which is that these riskier mortgages, instead of being stamped with Fannie and Freddie's guarantee, were sold to Wall Street firms. Wall Street firms packaged them into securities, and credit rating agencies came along and sliced and diced these securities into things that were rated everything from AAA, which was supposedly the same as a Fannie and Freddie security, down to riskier tranches. And then Wall Street came up with funds that would buy the riskier tranches to make the whole thing be a perpetual motion machine. Anyway, but the whole definition of a non-conforming mortgage, a subprime mortgage, used to be something that could not be sold to Fannie and Freddie. So by definition, Fannie and Freddie only did conforming mortgages. As the market began to go crazy, they began to lose market share because they wouldn't do this business. So their market share slid from something like 60 or 80% of the market in 2000 all the way down to 30% by 2004, at which point the companies had an existential crisis. They were, after all, publicly traded companies with a bottom line. And their executive said, what do? Do we enter this business? Do we start guaranteeing riskier loans? Or do we steer clear of it? And you can trace this through internal documents at the companies, just this huge angst about what they should do. And they ended up moving into riskier loans. And they began to guarantee riskier loans as well as buy riskier loans and hold them on their own balance sheets right at the worst possible time, just as the market was reaching its height of craziness. And that's a good part of the reason why they needed to be taken over and put into conservatorship. But they were late to this market. They weren't the ones who started it or who led the decline in standards. They were late to it.
Yeah,
so.
They absolutely were desperately following the curve. And you think about the boundaries of the conforming mortgage. So there's a limit on the size of the loan. So loans that were above, say, around $400,000 or so wouldn't qualify for Fannie and Freddie standards. And then there are the other dimensions like credit worthiness, so a certain credit score and then a certain down payment. And you saw during the financial, during the boom period, the subprime loans pushed on all of those dimensions, often simultaneously. So what Fannie and Freddie would call layered risk, right, where you have, okay, we're going to expand the dimensions on one of these, and we're going to offer lower credit score borrowers, but now on top of that, we're going to require a smaller down payment. So we'll be exposed to risk even sooner. And then on top of that, we'll give a larger loan, and so we'll change those. And so you saw sort of Fannie bumping up against all of those different dimensions, and they begin to expand their efforts in each of those directions in small ways. At the same time, they're buying up all these loans, and so the portfolio does reach, as you said, $1.3 trillion, which is really hard to fathom just how many loans they're buying up. And then we hit the crisis, and so then. House prices, which are believed to sort of never fall on a nationwide scale, fall something like 30% nationwide, 25 to 30%, depending on your favorite house price index. What happens to Fannie and Freddie as prices start to turn in the wrong direction? They've doubled down on housing-related risk by holding this portfolio that's perfectly correlated with their insurance
Right.
business.
So think about that. Fannie and Freddie were by statute only allowed to be in one business, which was the American mortgage market. The business that you're in, prices decline 30%. What's going to happen to any business? It's going to run into problems, right? I wanted to back up and make one other point about the financial crisis, because this is a pet peeve of mine. It's a little bit separate from Fannie and Freddie, although they were part of it. But so it has become, after the financial crisis, it's become this referendum on homeownership, right? Now we all know that you shouldn't give mortgages to people who can't afford to own homes, because that leads to a financial crisis. So we should never extend mortgages to people on the margin ever again. I think A, that's mean, and B, it's not true, and it's mean because it's not true. If you actually look at the data behind most risky mortgages, the defaults were actually caused by cash out refinancings, where people take out a mortgage bigger than the one they had before and spend the cash either on bills, on going on vacation. Remember the banners around town from the big banks, let your home take you on vacation? And there's actually if you break down all the numbers, there's some estimates that less than 10% of riskier loans made during the run-up to the financial crisis went to first-time home buyers. If you had limited these products to people who were actually trying to become homeowners, you never would have had a financial crisis. And there's some really interesting new data from the National Bureau of Economic Research showing that the majority of the defaults were actually upper-income borrowers who were doing cash-out refis. It wasn't. So homeownership may or may not be something we need to rethink, but the financial crisis doesn't prove it one way or another. It's not a referendum on this idea of homeownership. So anyway, moving on to the financial crisis. So
no, that's a great point to add, though. I mean, the one other fact I will add to the pile of sort of facts on this point is, if you look at the home ownership rate, which had been rising from the mid 90s onward, it really peaks in 2004, which is 2 years before prices peaked, right? And so prices are still rising as people are sort of shuffling and reshuffling or flipping properties. But there's
doing
no
cash-out refis.
Or doing cash out refis,
Right.
But there's no movement on getting first-time home buyers into
Right.
the market at that point. And some of that is exactly what you'd expect, is that prices were so high that it was prohibitively expensive for lower income, younger households to get in at that point. So by 2004, you actually see no increase in the home ownership rate.
So what happened for a long time, people actually viewed, and politicians thought, that Fannie and Freddie could save all of us, and there was pressure on them to do more and more and more as the private market fell apart. And it's a really interesting note to pause on, because there was always one of the criticisms of Fannie and Freddie during the boom years was, well, they don't really do anything for housing anyway. The private market's here. Why do we need Fannie and Freddie? They don't really lower mortgage rates. Well, we actually saw why we needed them when private capital started to desert the mortgage market in 2007. Because without Fannie and Freddie, the mortgage market would have ground to a total halt. So there was pressure on them to do more and more and more to guarantee more and more mortgages. Some people on Wall Street saw that there was going to be a problem at Fannie and Freddie, but the politicians didn't seem to. And so during the year before Fannie and Freddie were taken over, there were constant reassurances from their regulator that they were on perfectly sound financial footing, that they had plenty of capital, that everything was going to be just hunky-dory, and you shouldn't worry. And in fact, they sold all this preferred stock at the urging of the government to shore up their capital to community banks. And the preferred stock becomes important later in the story, which is why I'm mentioning it. But by the summer of 2008, it was pretty clear that was all wishful thinking, and there was going to be a big problem here. And the funny thing is, if you are a conspiracy theorist, and I am not entirely, but there were don't laugh, but there were also a string of leaks from the government during the summer of 2008 saying these two companies are going to have to be taken over, shareholders are going to be wiped out, they're going to be put into conservatorship. And they were well-informed enough leaks that there is a little bit of that actually caused a huge loss of confidence among Fannie and Freddie's investors, because if you're reading a leak from somebody in Treasury that's saying, hey, we're going to have to take over this company and wipe you out, what are you going to do? You're going to sell your stock, right? And run for the exits. So there are still a lot of people today who believe that Fannie and Freddie I shouldn't say a lot, there is a vocal core of people who believe that Fannie and Freddie never actually had to be taken over, and this was all orchestrated by the government as a way to get rid of two companies that they didn't like.
So the terms of the takeover, which is classified as a conservatorship, becomes really important to understand why they're still in this limbo status 7 years later. Right. And one of the key numbers is this 80% number, right? So can you tell us a little bit about how the conservatorship works? So we've made our timeline all the way from the 1930s up to up to 7 years ago.
So the government takes over Fannie and Freddie, and this was actually before Lehman weekend. So people remember the date when Lehman went bankrupt as the beginning of the financial crisis, but it actually, the crescendo of events really started with the government placing Fannie and Freddie into conservatorship. And what they did was they took a right to own 79.9% of the common stock. They didn't take 100%, in part because they didn't want to put the debt of Fannie and Freddie on the U.S. balance sheet, because that would have caused our debt to soar. So they left this common stock outstanding. They also left the preferred stock, which I had mentioned, that had been sold outstanding, although the idea was with the government owning 79.9% of the companies and then having the right to have Fannie and Freddie pay them a 10% dividend on any money they drew from the government, that this preferred stock was going to be worthless, and it fell to pennies on the dollar. So the community banks who had bought it in the run-up to this at the urging of the government were completely, we'll say penalized. That's a better word than what I was going to use. We're completely penalized by this structure. But the structure was very strange, and it was very different than the bank bailout, which came later. If you think about TARP and how friendly the TARP terms were, and it was a 5% dividend, and none of the bank executives had to go, and everything was very friendly. Fannie and Freddie's executives were all fired. They had to fire their lobbyists, and they had to pay a 10% dividend on any money they drew from the U.S. government. And this is a little bit of an accounting concept, but it becomes important. They had to draw based on not just on any cash losses they had, but on estimates of future losses. So if the accountants thought mortgages were going to default at a really high rate and cause losses down the road, Fannie and Freddie had to take all of that into their losses at once. So they drew this huge sum of money, $187 billion, but a lot of it was based on these estimates of losses that actually never came true. But because they had to pay a 10% dividend on that money, the idea was they are never going to get free. One of the former Fannie executives actually described it as a concrete life preserver. And it is one of the things that makes people think, wait, there was something else going on here. The US government saw an opportunity to get rid of these two companies, or to make sure that they were never going to emerge from this state called conservatorship by these incredibly punitive terms. I'm a little mixed on that point, because none of the bailouts were consistent, right? We let Lehman fail, we saved other banks, we gave Citi a really friendly rescue, AIG didn't get such a friendly rescue. You know, it's very hard for me to be sure about the events of that fall, and I tend to cut the government a little bit of slack, because look, it's not like there was a precedent for all of this. It was the fog of war, and I think people generally were trying to do the best job they could under very difficult circumstances. But I do think there was definitely some sense of, we have an opportunity to get rid of these two companies, and we're gonna do it.
So the takeover creates this tension where the shareholders aren't entirely wiped out. So the stocks are still trading,
right?
And they go close to zero, but not all the way to zero,
right?
And this becomes a potential sort of long shot bet that's taken up by,
I'm going to fight you on that
by
one.
hedge funds.
We disagree on this point.
So even early on, before some changes to the arrangement, we see some hedge funds moving into these investment opportunities, and then that grows as sort of the events unfold of how the conservatorship is going to work. So sort of what's the hedge fund perspective here, and how does that evolve over this conservatorship period?
Right. So you had these hedge funds who are generally scouring the market for rock bottom investments, right? And they find these securities of Fannie and Freddie, the common stock and the preferred stock that was left, and they say, wait a minute, these two companies, all these losses they're declaring, these aren't actually real. These losses are way overstated. These companies are going to become profitable again, and when they become profitable, they're going to be really profitable. And sure, there's all this rhetoric that the government says they want to kill the companies and that they never want to come back. But A, that's not what the law governing their conservatorship actually says. The law governing their conservatorship is very is law, and it doesn't say we're going to kill these two companies. So the hedge funds read the law and they say, well, this is what the law says. This is actually probably a pretty good investment. They're going to have to either come back in some form or be wound down. And then the hedge funds took it a step further and said, how do you get rid of Fannie and Freddie, which is where the U.S. government sort of ended up too. And then the hedge funds actually said, I don't think you can get rid of these two companies. There's no other way to structure housing finance in this country. And so this is a great investment. And so they bought. And then.
And then I'll let you pick up the story there.
And then, so in the summer of 2012, the U.S. government abruptly changed the rules. They said, and this was right before Fannie and Freddie started producing mammoth amounts of profits, just as the investors had predicted. The U.S. government said, wait, we're not just going to take 10% dividend on what you owe us. We're going to take every penny you make from now until eternity. And the ostensible excuse for doing this was that Fannie and Freddie were going to lose money. They weren't going to be able to pay this 10% dividend. So wasn't it kinder to just take all their money? It's sort of like as if someone lent you money to buy something and maybe you couldn't pay. And so they said, well, since we're not sure you can pay, instead of just taking 10% of your income, we're going to take every dollar you ever make. And if you do better than we thought, that's too bad for you. A hedge fund manager actually described it this way. He said, it's like I took 80% of your house in the financial crisis and you clawed your way back and you were about to start making it, and the lender said, no, actually, I'm going to take 100%. So the thing that is sort of implausible about all of this is that the government says, we didn't know these two companies were about to become really profitable, but everybody knew these two companies were about to become really profitable. So it doesn't make a ton of sense. And what's sort of undeniable is the effect on the budget. Over 2013 and 2014, Fannie and Freddie contributed $178 billion to the budget, thereby reducing our budget deficit and helping all the spending wars in Washington, because the huge profits from these two companies helped paint a much prettier picture than it otherwise would have been. So not surprisingly, the investors sued. And so there are about maybe 24 lawsuits by investors against the U.S. government saying, this isn't fair. You can't just come along and take our property. Because the regulator, Fannie and Freddie, actually said when they were put into conservatorship, this stock might have value someday. These preferred shares, this common stock might be worth something someday. So it's I have some sympathy for the investors. I know you do not.
Well, I have less. I mean, I think that the challenge here is that these entities were always sort of straddling this public-private divide and trying to figure out how to resolve these GSEs that are fundamentally providing some sort of public service. I think you have a great line in your book where you talk about the sort of the financial calculus of Wall Street versus the political calculus of Washington. And so I think there is a certain amount of either naivete on the hedge fund investors' view to not realize that the government would take a larger role in this, especially when they saw what a cash cow it was going to be, and everyone knew it was going to be, right? It's an insurance company, and there are no losses. And so when an insurance company is just collecting premiums, right? So when there are no fires, the fire insurance company does very well.
It's a fascinating example of the gap between Washington and Wall Street's thinking, because Wall Street people said to me, well, this is what the law says. So sure, there was rhetoric around killing these two companies, but that's not what the law said. And once they became profitable, of course the rhetoric's going to change. What we do in this country, whether it's General Motors or Chrysler or the big banks or AIG, is we take companies that have fallen on hard times and restructure them. We figure out how to make them work a little bit better. That's what we do. Washington people, on the other hand, said, and some people actually said this to me, you should have known you were nationalized and that your stock didn't really exist. We would have done it if we could have done it. We know that we didn't do it just because we couldn't. And so it doesn't matter what we actually did. What matters is what we wanted to do, and you should have known better than to buy these shares. So it's just this huge gap into two ways of seeing the world.
So where do Fannie and Freddie go from here, and how does that sort of inform our thoughts about the role of the government in housing finance going forward?
I think it's really complicated. So one of the things, and it was a part of the hedge fund play, but I think it's pretty widely accepted now, it is very difficult in this country to have a market that doesn't involve the government, because a 30-year fixed rate mortgage would probably go away. You have a paper showing that mortgage credit would vary pretty dramatically across this country. So one of the things Fannie and Freddie did, they did this thing called cross-subsidization, where wealthier borrowers in effect subsidize not only lower income borrowers but the middle class. So across this country, which is very diverse income-wise and very diverse geographically speaking, people paid about the same rate for mortgage credit. And they paid about the same rate, and mortgage credit was available in good times and in bad times. If you don't have some sort of government backing, then chances are you have and we don't really know, right, because Fannie's been around since the Great Depression. But you don't really, you probably have huge variety in mortgage credit. The wealthy people would probably still be able to get a 30-year fixed rate mortgage at a decent cost. Lower income people would probably get 5 to 10-year floating rate mortgages at a much higher rate. And mortgage credit would vary pretty dramatically depending on the conditions in the market. So one thing we definitely saw is that private capital deserts an asset class it doesn't like. And even now, 7 years after the financial crisis, there's very little private capital that's come back into the mortgage market. So even people who ideologically have wanted to say, let's get the government out of the mortgage market, they actually look at the facts of it and say, especially in a time where one of our chief worries is income inequality, it would be a very, I think it is a very, very tough case to make. And so that's been one of the difficulties in figuring out how you go forward. Another part of the difficulty has been you still have foreign investors and owning these Fannie and Freddie Mae securities. And if you were to shut down Fannie and Freddie, then these securities would plummet in value. And investors, many of whom are also financing our treasury debt, would be really angry. So that's not a good situation either. So it becomes really hard to figure out what to do with them. And so we seem to be stuck in this state of limbo while another crisis looms. And it's interesting, since the crisis, the homeownership rate has plunged. We're actually back to where we were, and by some measures, we're back to where we were 48 years ago. It's plunged particularly steeply in minority communities, and rental rates are soaring. And so people have said there's this housing crisis coming, and that Americans aren't going to be able to afford housing, with rental rates going through the roof and homeownership rates plummeting. And people say homeownership should be lower, that it was too high before the financial crisis, and maybe that's true. But people need to sleep somewhere. So if it's not going to be in a home they own, it's going to be in a home they rent. And so there's this looming problem coming. And so you have a lot of push from civil rights groups, from affordable housing activists, to do something with Fannie and Freddie, and to bring them back, so that they can live up to their mandate and help with affordable housing.
I think it's really interesting to think about the sort of risk-based pricing element as it relates to income inequality. So if you think about the future market that you're describing, where high-income people sort of who are low credit risk would still qualify for these 30-year fixed-rate mortgages, what that means is that they have a constant payment throughout the life of the loan, right? So for 30 years, you make the same payment and you've paid off the loan. If the trade-off for less credit-worthy or lower-income households is a floating or adjustable rate mortgage, that means that the households that are least capable of sort of handling big payment shocks are the ones who are exposed to it, right? So when interest rates change, their payments will change on an annual basis, and they might actually have the hardest time kind of adjusting to that. And so you face this tension where you think that, in these types of credit markets, we say, well, the price that you pay for credit should kind of reflect your risk, right? If I'm a riskier credit card borrower, maybe I should pay a higher rate for that risk. But that higher risk that is sort of, it's not something that's inherent about me. It's really something about my income or something about my characteristics. The neighborhood that I live in might be more dangerous, for instance.
Right. It theoretically sounds good, risk-based pricing, every person for themselves, right? But when it comes to something like homeownership, which not only is an economic asset for most people and has been the primary means for building wealth for lower-income people throughout our history, but it also it shapes the kind of communities we live in. Then it becomes a very fraught issue, particularly in this day and time. So I think there is this actual acceptance in the government that you need to preserve access to a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, and so you need to keep some sort of government presence in the mortgage market. But then it becomes about, well, how do you actually do that? And I've come to believe that Fannie and Freddie are a little bit like Winston Churchill's famous adage about democracy. It's the worst possible system with the possible exception of everything else. I'm not sure there's a better way to do it. People also, posit this private market alternative as if the big banks taking over more of the mortgage market would be the private market, but it's not. I mean, in the run-up to the crisis, the big banks were GSEs too, right? They had to be bailed out by the government. They too had an implicit guarantee. So you can argue that the Dodd-Frank financial reform legislation has fixed that, and the big banks can be allowed to fail now. but if they control the American mortgage market, they won't be allowed to fail in the next crisis, in which case they too are GSEs. So this notion that people posit that there's a private market solution is actually not even really true, because I think any large institution that is fundamental to the American mortgage market can't be allowed to fail in a crisis.
Right, right. So the trade-off there is you make the guarantee even more implicit.
Right.
You hide it even further from the surface, and you make it even harder to price, right? So one advantage of sort of formalizing the system in a more insurance kind of context is you could sort of more directly price the price.
As ugly as Fannie and Freddie's political power was, can you picture a big bank executive and a congressman meeting preferably in a dark room, right? And the big bank executive says, well, I want you to go easy on derivatives legislation. And the congressman says, sure, but I need you to loosen the spigot of mortgage credit in my state in order to boost the economy, right? I mean, Fannie and Freddie's political power might have been ugly in the heyday, but to me, that sort of putting everything in the nation's largest institutions, I actually think, in retrospect, we have a system of checks and balances in the government for a reason. And Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac actually kind of were a check until they lost their way at the peak of the financial crisis. But they actually were companies that enforced standards in the mortgage market and were kind of a check on the power of big financial institutions. And I'm not sure in the end that that's the worst structure. I'm open to argument about that, but I'm not sure it's the worst structure. Well, we could do worse.
We could do worse is probably as happy a note as we can end on with this conversation.
That's depressing.
Well, thank you so much. I want to turn the questions over to the audience, who I'm sure have better questions than I have. So if you have questions, I think the idea is to come line up here in the back, and we have a microphone there in the back.
Gotcha.
And there's a microphone over here as well on the left, on your left.
So I have one super quick question and then one longer one.
Okay.
The first one is, can the government even be sued? It has sovereign immunity under a number of circumstances. What's the case here?
They can be sued. There's a takings clause that you can sue under, and they're suing under the takings clause. And they're suing under, there are a couple of other statutes that they're suing under.
Sweet.
But yeah.
So it's legal. So the longer one is, what happens if future Fannie or Freddie were to fail?
If what? I'm so
if
sorry.
a future Fannie or Freddie were to fail, like they cannot meet their obligations, and there's a bunch of people with mortgages guaranteed this way, do they just get to keep their houses for free?
Well, right now, that's a good question. Well, right now it's a huge issue because you have collectively the largest financial institution in the world operating with no capital. And so the mantra since the financial crisis, right, has been capital, capital, capital. That's what's going to make the system safer. And you have the largest financial institution in the world operating with no capital. So when Fannie and Freddie suffer losses, they're going to have to draw from U.S. taxpayers again. They still have a $200 billion line of credit from us, U.S. taxpayers, but even that $200 billion line of capital is small compared to $5 trillion in liabilities. It wouldn't make them well capitalized by the standard of any other financial institution. So basically, their credit book is pristine. So I don't want to be an alarmist and pretend there's about to be a problem. But if there is a problem, it's a big problem. There's not really a mechanism in place to fix that. No, I don't think that means that you just get to keep your house.
I have a question. You've been using the word Fannie Mae and Freddie Mae.
Yeah.
Well, what is the difference statutory in their assets and liabilities? And the same question, you've both been using the word insurance, and then you've also been talking about them buying the mortgages. That's how you describe it. If they're buying the mortgages, they're just own them as assets.
No.
If a third party has the mortgage, then they may be giving insurance like AIG did.
Right.
So what business are they in, and how do they differ between?
I skimmed over the description a little bit. What they actually do is they take mortgages made by a primary lender and they stamp them with their guarantee. Then they package them into securities and sell them off to other investors. So what
just like AI? Oh no, not.
Yeah, no, just so what they're left with is the guarantee that they will pay. They get a fee in exchange for guaranteeing that they'll pay if you, the homeowner, can't. They collect a small fee in return for that, and that fee has varied over time. And then their other business was taking these mortgages and owning them on their own balance sheet. So they would bear the losses on those mortgages too, obviously, that were on their own balance sheet.
They would not have to insure the ones that they held themselves. So
They
they're
would-
actually in two businesses.
They
the
were in-
AIG business and the.
Sort of, yeah. They were in
Sounds
a portfolio business and an insurance business.
But were there any differences between Fannie Mae and Freddie Mae?
Between Fannie and Freddie, not really. There's some very technical differences. Freddie is much smaller and was always much less politically powerful. So Fannie was always the older, bigger, more politically powerful sibling. Fannie was always much smaller and still is today. And they do business a little bit differently, and Fannie's securities price a little bit differently, but they're essentially in the same business.
So why two?
Well, that's a really good. It's a really good question, and people have said, well, why not just have one of them? Other people have said, well, having two of them keeps them honest because there's at least some competition. There's all this economic theory around duopolies versus oligopolies and what makes more sense for effective competition. But you could certainly argue that there should just be one.
Yeah. So Freddie was created really with this explicit idea that it would compete.
That it would compete with Fannie.
And you can sort of imagine those different dynamics, right? Where there's the dynamic between the two siblings who fight all the time and actually could compete for resources, and then there's the version where the siblings gang up on the parents, right? And that's much more of the model. So they've tended to be more followers than actually direct competitors.
I think there's a question on that. Over here. I grew up in Minnesota, so I want to thank you and Gretchen for all this reporting on this financial malfeasance that we've been having to deal with for the last 15 years. My question to you, but I have an observation and a quick question. Quick observation. The way you originally described early on in the conversation, Fannie Mae sounds a lot like the Federal Reserve in the way you described it. But my question to you is, the Federal Reserve shoveled out like $15-16 trillion, probably, when all said and done. Why do we still have this? Where did that money go? Because we still have over $1 trillion in underwater mortgages. We have over $1 trillion in student loan debt. I think that's really the big picture here, and I'm really angry about that because it seems like a capital strike has been put on the country after we bailed out the banks, and none of the bankers were fired in that office with Barack Obama in the spring of 2009, unlike the GM CEO.
Well, you can see that the government had its favored children in the bailout, right? And it's very clear in retrospect, and you can see it in Treasury's comments about Fannie and Freddie. It's really interesting. The Treasury has always said, we American taxpayers got a really good deal on their bailout of the big banks. Look at how much money we made from the bailout of the big banks. They returned the funds they got from taxpayers. Look at what a great deal we got. Then just recently, the Treasury said about without taking into account all the other ways in which the banks were aided, like the mechanism which you just mentioned. And then about Fannie and Freddie, the Treasury says they can never pay American taxpayers back for the enormous risk that American taxpayers took on bailing them out, despite the fact that Fannie and Freddie have paid $50 billion more back to the Treasury than they took. And the difference in the views of the companies is sort of encapsulated by that, right? The banks have been marvelous, wonderful children who paid everything back and did beautifully, and no matter what Fannie and Freddie do, they can never compensate the taxpayers for the risk they took. And I think it's very telling. It shows who are the favored children and who are the stepchildren in this bailout.
On 2008, there was some discussion of forming a bad bank that would buy the mortgage-backed assets from the banks, probably at a big discount, and then as the owner of the underwater mortgages, it could mark down the principal. That path was not chosen. I wonder how the politics of that rejection interact with the politics of going forward with Fannie and Freddie, because I think some of the origins of Fannie during the Great Depression had something to do with a similar idea of the government being a buyer of mortgage assets, and also more recently the Resolution Trust Corporation during the savings and loan crisis.
Well, people have said, I don't know that this is true, but people have said that Fannie and Freddie took some $40 billion of bad bank assets onto their own books when they were put into conservatorship. So there was also an effort to shift the losses from the banks onto Fannie and Freddie. I'm not 100% sure that's true, but that's always been part of the story. If you're a GSE conspiracy theorist.
I was hoping to go back to Nick's question earlier about what will happen if another failure came. but take it up in a kindly, slightly different angle. So earlier you mentioned that basically, in the Washington rhetoric at least, it was not so much what they actually did, but what they thought or what they really wanted to do. So they didn't really nationalize these companies, but everyone kind of knew that it was coming. That said, at what point can we actually infer what's the government's real intentions versus like what the law or what it seems to be on paper?
Right.
So there's a lot of tricky questions there in terms of like if you think about the slippery slope kind of implications of what that has. If what government says isn't what it really means, and it can really do whatever it wants to do,
Right.
like where's that? How do you make that judgment?
Right. Well, that's part of the reason that I'm a huge fan of the hedge fund lawsuits. Whether you want to see the investors get paid or not, I generally think sunlight on government actions involving government power is a really good thing. And if you didn't have wealthy investors suing the U.S. government over this, would never actually know what happened, and there'd be no challenge to what happened here. Maybe there is a really good explanation for what the government did when it decided to take 100% of the two companies' profits. If there is a really good explanation, I haven't heard it yet, and I'm actually glad that somebody with money is taking on the government and saying, let's see what happens. I happen to think we're a nation of laws, and so the answer has to be what's written in the law. It can't be all the unsaid or unspoken things that you were supposed to be able to read into the situation. It has to be what was written in the law. But it is a really interesting question about where we are today and about what happens if with Fannie and Freddie, because there are a lot of risks, right? Not only the risk that the two of them lose a huge amount of money and that sends the system into a tailspin, but there's a risk that the investors win in the court. Nobody knows what recompense would be, what they would get, but it could force a lurch in our housing system that isn't exactly what any of us want to see. And there's also a risk coming. We have an election coming up, and whether there's an administration change or not, there might be different attitudes toward affordable housing. While the Obama administration hasn't taken any efforts to fix Fannie and Freddie, they have tried to take some steps on the affordable housing issue, but none of that is baked into statute and could all go away in a new administration. So I think there are a lot of things out there to be worried about.
Marvelous discussion, and you're both great. I have a nephew who's got kind of a big job at the headquarters of Fannie Mae.
Oh.
He can walk home because it's downhill. I don't know how he gets there. But I'm glad to hear that you think that they're going to survive.
Well,
He can pay the $20 back to me someday that he owes me. But aren't there some long knives out there that want to do them in? I wonder if you could talk a little bit about them. And then also, some of the other major countries of the world, do they have something similar?
So I think it's debatable whether Fannie and Freddie survive. I'm not sure. Nobody knows what to do to get rid of them, but there's still a very clear message coming from the government and from the Treasury. We will not bring these two companies back. Where it gets murky is when you start to push them on. Well, what are you going to do instead if you don't bring these two companies back? Because there is not a plan B. There never has been. There's some sort of vague hope that we can do things to get the private market to revive itself, but thus far it's just a drop in the bucket of a huge ocean. And as I've said, I'm skeptical about what a private market actually really means. But it's by no means certain that Fannie and Freddie are coming back. In fact, there was a bill that made it through the Senate Banking Committee in 2014, and it explicitly killed Fannie and Freddie. And one guy who's involved in housing finance went in to see Senator Corker, who sponsored it, and said, well, look, you could do all of this really easily if you use the GSE's existing infrastructure and use their profits to fund a new system, and then we can restructure Fannie and Freddie in a way that resolves some of the issues with how they were structured before, and that's a sensible way to do this. And Corker was like, if it involves bringing Fannie, at least the way the story was told to me, if it involves bringing Fannie and Freddie back, there's no way. It's a non-starter if any piece of these two companies survives. There's this incredible animus toward them still in DC today. And I think I think part of that is the way they pushed people around during their heyday. It's very personal. I got a very negative book review from somebody who was very opposed to Fannie and Freddie, and he was wrong about one thing. I really do let things go, but he was wrong about one thing. So I did not let that go, and we ended up getting into this email battle. And at the end of the email battle, he finally said, "Well, I don't care if you're right. I just hate these two companies," and that sort of sums up the attitude to them in some quarters. So I wouldn't be so sanguine just yet about getting your $20 back. On the subject of what other countries do, so there has been this, well, other countries don't have a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, and they're just fine, so why do we need a 30-year fixed rate mortgage? Well, one reason is we've always had it. I don't know how you go about taking away something that Americans have had. Typically, that doesn't work so well. But another issue is that a lot of these countries in Europe that have a higher percentage of rental households, they have a bigger safety net than we do too. Housing has traditionally been part of our safety net for people. So if you're going to get rid of that, well, then you might have to do more on other aspects of the safety net. And then a third thing, people point to European countries and say, well, they don't have government involved in their housing market. Their banks finance the housing market. Well, guess what? Europe had to bail out all of its banks in the financial crisis because they couldn't let their banks fail. So how, in the end, were their banks any different than Fannie and Freddie? They were government-sponsored institutions too. So I think people draw this artificial line between the private market and the government that is drawn in an arbitrary place, when if you actually think about it, it's not so true. So, and we have a very different history of banking in our country than other places do. We historically, not so much today based on where we are, but have been opposed to big banks. We were scared of big banks, and we believed a nation of smaller banks was better, but that actually meant a fractured system that then couldn't finance the mortgage market in the same way other countries, huge national banks, have been able to do.
Right.
So.
Right. We waited about 200 years to found a central bank.
Yeah.
for partly
and
this
believe it or
reason.
not, we were once opposed to big banks. I mean,
Yeah.
that's here we are. Anyway, go ahead.
So we have time for just one more question, I think.
So on the future of housing policy in America, who do you see as national leaders on the issue to either reform, or you think is going to put up together big plans? I mean, I haven't seen anything from any of the presidential candidates on housing policy in general. It's just bashing the big banks, but in terms of housing policy, this is one of the most important economic issues that you said affect every single family in America. So who do you see as leaders on this, and if there are any, what are their plans going forward?
That's a great question. I have been waiting for somebody to bring it up in a debate. Maybe you can figure out how to get somebody to talk about it. They will not. I mean, the presidential candidates, the most they've done is Carly Fiorina has repeated the Republican Party line, which is that Fannie and Freddie caused the housing crisis, caused the financial crisis, and so we need to get rid of them and get rid of regulations because it was all Fannie and Freddie's fault. And that's been that's been the most substantive talk about Fannie and Freddie. There have been some plans floated, but a lot of them are implausible because they don't deal with sort of two key aspects of this market, which is one, transition, how do we get from where we are to where we're going, and two, how much private capital is there really to finance the American mortgage market? Does private capital want American credit risk? And the answer is no, not in very big sums. So a lot of the plans that float around there sort of have this idea that private capital is going to come in and take America's credit risk. When people do the numbers, they say it's just not there in the size that people think. So I think we should be having a debate about this. People can disagree that Fannie and Freddie are the right solution. They can disagree about the presence of the government in the market. But to just not talk about it, I think, is really unfortunate because then it lets decisions get made in dark corners where none of us understand the impact it's going to have on a very major part of our lives until it's too late. I firmly believe that if this weren't Fannie and Freddie, the government wouldn't have been able to get away with what it did in the summer of 2012, taking all their profits. There would have been an outcry. As it was, there was nothing, because people don't want to engage with these two companies despite the fact that they're so important to all of us. So engage. There.
So
thank you all very much for coming tonight.
Yeah, so this is one great step towards engaging. So.
Please join me in thanking Bethany McLean and Ben Keys. Thank you both very much for the conversation. We hope that you'll continue it. And Bethany has been kind enough to agree to sign books over the table. The University of Chicago Bookstore is selling copies of her new book. It's called Shaky Ground, The Strange Saga of the U.S. Mortgage Giants. And I should say it's also from the Columbia Journalism School has a new imprint called Columbia Global Reports. And this book is one in a series of new endeavors that they're doing to really bring rigorous long-form reporting into book format. So it is much deeper than your standard magazine article, but it's a shorter, compact book. The effort here is really to allow you to get a deep dive into a complicated subject that is important and pressing and relevant in just a couple of sittings. So I encourage you to check out this book in greater detail. Shaky Ground. And Bethany and Ben, thank you so much again. Thank you all very much for being here.